Governor Reagan, an incumbent president is generally supposed to have considerable advantage within his own party and with the electorate generally. You have said that you have not made up your mind yet whether you will challenge President Ford for the nomination. Seeing that this incumbency gives so many advantages, you must either disagree with the president on some issues or think he does not have the strength to win.
No. Let me give my answer in this way. I think this nation is at a point where there needs to be a turn in the direction that we've been following for too many years, too many decades. I think we're in danger of becoming a second-rate power, economically as well as militarily. I think the problems are so great that I'm doing everything I can and whatever I can to helpfully influence a solution to those problems, just as at least one voice. I've made no decision about 1976 as for myself or for anyone else, because I think we should be dealing with these problems. Whenever there is a decision to be made, I'm going to make it on the basis of what I think is best for the United States.
From CBS News, Washington, a spontaneous and unrehearsed news interview on Face the Nation with Ronald Reagan, former governor of California. Governor Reagan will be questioned by CBS News correspondent Bruce Morton, David S. Broder, national political correspondent for the Washington Post, and CBS News correspondent George Herman. Face the Nation is produced by CBS News, which is solely responsible for the selection of today's guest and panel.
Governor Reagan, when you say that the United States has to take a sharp turn, a different policy, that sounds very much like some kind of disagreement with the president. Presumably, you're talking about a turn from the direction in which we are now going under President Ford.
Well, now, let me clarify one thing.
Please.
We've occasionally had a Republican president in the White House, but for more than 40 years, policy in this country has been determined by the Democratic Party. They've had a majority in both houses of the Congress. And a president is an executive officer. He cannot force policy on a hostile or disagreeing Congress, and that is true right now. When I say this country needs a change in direction, I'm speaking about a policy that has been growing over the last 40 years that has led to a gigantic bureaucracy that I think is out of control of Congress now, beyond their control, a centralization of authority in the national government, a trend that is contrary to all the principles that I ever grew up believing in. And that's the direction I'm talking about turning. I think the president has made efforts to reverse that and turn it around and been overruled by the Congress.
Governor, are you convinced that Mr. Ford is really running for re-election?
Well, I know that every time you come to Washington, you hear that question and you hear the rumors both ways as to whether he is or isn't. All I can say is that if I could use the terms of my previous profession, if he isn't, he's playing the part of a candidate very well.
Governor, other conservatives have expressed specific disagreements with President Ford over things like the size of the budget deficit or the policy of détente. Have you any specific policy disagreements with what the president has tried to do?
Well, I don't want to get into a running down a laundry list of where we disagree, where we agree. But of course, there are bound to be disagreements. I myself believe I cannot support the size of the deficit that has been agreed to. I differed on other points. I agree on other points, but I don't think there's any purpose served in just trying to find those specifics as to on which incident or which decision I agree or disagree.
Well, last night in Atlantic City, Governor, you said that I'm quoting you now, the free world is crying out for strong American leadership, and we are not providing it. Neither are we providing a strong, lasting, consistent foreign policy. Isn't that a fairly harsh thing to say about a president, particularly when he's in the middle of international negotiations?
Well, now that we was all-inclusive. The president, for example, asked the Congress of the United States in the closing chapters of the tragedy in Vietnam for action which the Congress refused. Again, we come back to the fact that the Congress, with its War Powers Act 2 years ago, took away from the President of the United States the ability to even enforce the terms of the ceasefire which this country had signed. And this does not necessarily mean criticism of the president, because he made it clear what he wanted to do. The Congress of the United States, and it's almost the first time that I can recall this happening, refused to back an agreement that had been signed by the Secretary of State in the name of the President with regard to that ceasefire. It brought our prisoners home. It brought our men out of combat. It was an armistice. And then we were to go forward with the idea of a permanent peace, which would, of course, have to be ratified by the Senate. But the Congress 2 years ago just put the United States, or the President of the United States, in the position of sending a Secretary of State someplace now to try to negotiate settlements such as in the Middle East.
Well, I'm getting the impression, Governor, that your disagreement really is with the Democratic Congress. But if that were the case, I would think you would have endorsed Mr. Ford for re-election and be preparing to run against Senator Tunney in California.
No, I have no ambition to oppose Senator Tunney in the Senate in California, or anyone else for that matter. As I've said before, I am going to make a decision when I make it, on the basis of what I think is good for this country. But when you suggest that my quarrel is with the Congress right now, I have to tell you, I believe this Congress has behaved more irresponsibly than any Congress I've known.
Governor,
well, the
if
reason
I can
that the Congress
go back
is
a minute. You said you'll make a decision when you make it. Running for president is complicated this time. There's a new campaign law. When, realistically, do you think you have to make that decision about?
Well, I haven't set any particular time, other than to say that I'm quite sure that anyone who would consider that has to make a decision at least by the end of the year.
The reason that the president has been having such trouble with the Congress is presumably because the Congress is so heavily Democratic. The Congress is so heavily Democratic, obviously, because so many Republicans have been losing elections lately. The president has been trying to broaden the Republican Party to win more seats, and you have objected to his attempt to broaden the party.
No, that's a false assumption.
Very well.
I have not. As a matter of fact, the speech I made at the Republican Leadership Conference in Washington, D.C., which caused discomfort to some of our Republican legislators who hadn't heard the speech and who went on the basis of questions that were asked of them in subsequent news conferences, the president assured me that he had read my speech and agreed with everything I'd said in it. I said that we should broaden the base of our party, not by making it more like the Democratic Party. 62% of the American voters stayed home from the polls in '74, and the majority of them said they did so because they didn't think there was enough difference between the two parties. I said we should broaden it the way we broadened it in 1972, when millions of Democrats and independents ignored party lines to come across, and whether they voted for Republicanism, they at least voted against what the leadership of the Democratic Party represented, which was a further centralization of authority, an extension of the welfare state, more confiscation and redistribution of the people's earnings. And this, to me, is the manner in which we should broaden the party, by giving the people a set of principles and standards, solutions to problems or proposed solutions, and sticking by them.
There is, you think, a conservative majority, if you take those to be conservative.
Well, if we're to believe the polls, when the people are presented the problems and the approach to solving those problems without any labels attached, all of the polls have been somewhat surprised to come out finding the majority of the American people opt for the conservative solution.
Do you think that any part of this strong Democratic majority in the Congress is a direct result of President Nixon's troubles?
Oh, I think that Watergate had a great effect. I think the fact that we had the smallest turnout that we've had in our national history was an indication that people were turned off. As a matter of fact...
What I'm leading to is, do you think that still hangs on for the party?
Well, I think maybe they got some of it out of their system. We had one example in a congressional race that had to be rerun. In one of our states, there was a Republican congressman who won by 44 votes. There was a challenge on the base of a faulty voting machine. So the solution was a rerun of that race in January. Now, the people had gotten it out of their systems. In that district, incidentally, there are only 7,500 registered Republicans in the whole district. You'd think that the Republican had very little chance. Now, in January, the people faced a decision just between two men on the basis of what those two men represented. The Republican won the rerun by 12,000 votes.
If it's out of their system, do you think there is now a part for ex-President Nixon to play in the political process?
Oh, I think only history will tell that. No, I'm talking about the anger of the people that disgust with the political process. A poll's just recently been taken by who's who among high school students. 23,000 young high school seniors were polled. 83% of them have declared that they are going to be in their first vote independent, neither political party, which I think is an indication of something. 81% of them, tragically enough, said that they don't believe that any elected politicians are honest. And 3 years ago, that figure was only 21%. Now, something has influenced these young people and influenced them in the wrong way.
Speaking of that independence, some of your fellow conservatives, particularly Bill Rusher from the National Review, have been arguing that it's time to get out of the Republican Party and form a new party that could really tap that independent spirit. Is that an option that is at all interesting to you?
No, I've been trying to interest my fellow Republicans in what I call a new second party, meaning that the Republican Party do what I said earlier, raise a standard and make it perfectly clear what we stand for, take a stand on various proposals and philosophy, mainly a philosophical stand, and then make it plain that we're not going to compromise those principles for political expediency or to try and win a group here or a group there. Our opponents have had a history, and I am a former Democrat, but we've had a history of building a majority by promising all things to all people, separating people into groups, dividing them, and then seeing if there isn't some promise we can make to that group and the other group. This has been the Democratic Party's history.
But do you rule out absolutely the third party option for 1976?
Well, no one in this day of flux can rule out anything, but I myself have been making the statement and believe that the history of third parties indicates that they usually succeed in electing the people they were set up to oppose.
Do you think that George Wallace has any part in a potential conservative coalition?
Well, George Wallace is working very hard to win the Democratic nomination. And I think that he's probably going to go to the convention with, if the polls are any indication, with the greatest number of delegates. And it's going to be most interesting to see the Democratic leadership cut him off, because I'm sure they have no intention of letting him have the nomination. Now,
is he conservative by your definition?
What?
Is he a conservative in your thinking?
Well, I think we have differences in that. I don't think that he is as opposed to government as such as I am. The idea of government doing things government shouldn't do. I think he's more opposed to who's doing it and what they're doing, but that his quarrel is not necessarily with a big, powerful government.
Well, Governor, if in fact he's locked out at the Democratic Convention, and if he goes the third party route, what does that do to this new majority you see on the conservative side? Doesn't he get some of those voters?
Oh, yes. There's no question about it, that this would go back to what I've said is the historic pattern of a third party. Because what it usually results in is two parties dividing up the same group of voters who have, in spite of the differences, more in common. And if they would unite, they could, as they did in 72, be a new realignment, a new majority.
How about John Connally of Texas, now a Republican? Is he a conservative? Would he fit into your movement and your ideas?
Well, John Connally and I'm sure, when we were fellow governors, of course, then he was a Democrat. We had some differences, but I always found him to be a very reasonable man, and certainly not one dedicated to the big central power theory of government. And I feel that he's going to be very active. We'll see. I know that he feels strongly as I do about getting out and speaking to the people and talking about the things that he thinks are wrong, and then we'll have an opportunity to see.
Governor, if you do challenge President Ford, do you then foresee a contest which is decided in the primaries? Do you have to run in all 30 or however many it's going to be states?
I don't know whether anyone could run in all of them or not, and the strategy about primaries is usually one that a campaign organization, once it's put together, not one mind doesn't make that decision. A number make the decision on where and which primaries you run in.
Our own survey of states and delegates, putative delegates to the convention, seems to indicate that you would start, even without lifting a finger overtly to get the nomination, that you would start with perhaps 30 or 35%, perhaps more, of the delegates. What can you do with that block if you decide not to run? What power can it give you?
Well,
that's a mighty powerful piece.
Yes, but I don't know if necessarily everyone who thinks someone should be the president is, and he does not follow that course, whether all of those people automatically accept his word as to what they should do. Just as I don't believe that the labor leaders today can deliver the labor union rank and file vote. They can deliver their money, which they've been doing quite consistently. And there is great unhappiness among the rank and file union members, if we're to believe the polls, about that power being exercised by the leaders. So I don't know whether you're a power broker or not. All I will do is express to the best of my ability what I sincerely believe is best for this country.
Governor, you've been serving with Vice President Rockefeller on the CIA Commission. Before we get to that specific thing, I'd like to get your appraisal of how he's doing as Vice President.
Well, the only view I have of him as Vice President is on that commission, and there he's serving and working hard, as we all are, and I think we're going to come out with a very sensible and factual report for the people.
Is that report likely to substantiate the charges that there was massive domestic surveillance on American citizens by the CIA?
Well, now, Dave, you have me a little at a disadvantage. We all of us agreed on the commission that we wouldn't give any interim reports. Now, I know that we're only a week or so away from the report being delivered. How free I can be to hedge or even
Well, let me ask
indicate
it this way, just not speaking for the commission, but for yourself. Do you have any serious misgivings in your mind about the performance of the CIA, particularly in regard to domestic surveillance?
No. I believe that there have been violations, of course. Any bureaucracy of about 16,000 people are going to be individuals who make mistakes and do things they shouldn't do. I think that they have been scattered over a 28-year period. I think the record shows that in many instances they themselves, when they came to light, corrected them without anyone having to take out after them. And I think that the most important thing we have today is to see that this nation maintains an organization capable of providing us with the counterintelligence we need for our own national security, because we are being spied upon beyond anything that the American people can possibly conceive, not internally, not by our own people, but by potential enemies.
You think your fellow commissioners largely agree with that view?
Yes. There may be here and there on points, as there always will be disagreement. Maybe now and then there'll be a footnote of one side or the other saying, well, we think this. But basically the commission has, I think, has made an all-out search for the truth.
Governor, if you do become a candidate, would you expect to disclose your personal financial holdings?
Oh, dear. I haven't even, as I said, I haven't made a decision, or don't know whether there's a decision about me to be made. I haven't even gotten around to thinking of things like that. Can I answer it on a broad way, a principle matter? I think that the American people are entitled to know anything that might constitute a conflict of interest with regard to anyone seeking public office at whatever level. On the other hand, I do not believe in those who think that simply because you're going to public life, you should forget that part of the Declaration of Independence that says a man should be safe in his books and records. I think that privacy has been one of the great freedoms of America. And beyond that point, I don't think
Governor,
that anything should be asked.
How would that...
Where the conflict is?
What?
If you leave it up to the candidate to decide whether there's a conflict of
no.
interest,
I believe, and we've had reforms in California that I agree with. I think the reforms are this: that you set a figure on anything that might constitute a conflict of interest. For example, ownership of X amount of stock in a company that could conceivably then affect, and you say, do you or do you not own above that amount? Agreeing that anything below that amount is insignificant enough that it does not constitute any conflict of interest. This, I think, any candidate should be willing to swear to. I think there's a great difference between that and saying, you must tell us exactly to the penny how much you own of this or that.
Should it be allowed
First of
to
all,
swear?
I don't have really too great a problem in that regard. I work for a living, too.
Should he be allowed to swear to it without any further verification? Is his word enough, or should there be some verification process?
I'm trying now, right now, you have me trying to think what the procedure is in our own laws in California on that.
Well, I'm just curious as to your own feeling
I can't
about it.
recall.
Whether there should some third party should look into it to verify.
That's all right with me, yes.
Okay. Governor, we've been calling you governor, but you are, of course, an ex-governor of California. What do you think of your successor? What kind of a job is he doing for the state? He's quite a different person from Governor Ronald Reagan.
Well, it's only been a few months. I think it's too early to give an evaluation of someone. I can only say that I look with happiness on the fact that he, too, is stingy with the public purse and is following a line of fiscal responsibility, and that has encouraged me greatly. I don't have enough information to give you any evaluation on other things that he's done.
I had one further follow-up question on the point of disclosure. In this period, when you are traveling extensively around the country and making speeches, there's also been reports in the Chicago Tribune and I think other places I've read that tax-exempt foundation funds are being used to put your radio program on the air in some cities. Are you prepared, if you become a candidate, to lay out the whole matter of the financing of this period of your private activity?
Dave, yes. As a matter of fact, the only thing I know of that kind, this program is syndicated. A syndicating company puts it up for sale to stations or to sponsors. I know that a group of young people, the Young Americans for Freedom, started a drive once that they wanted to raise money that they could sponsor it through their contributions on stations here and there in markets where it wasn't. I don't know that anything has ever come of that. I did not encourage it. I didn't ask for it because it's been very successful. Sponsors have been sponsoring it. It's on almost 300 stations now. Every bit of the expense and the maintenance of whatever it takes for me to go speak is being paid for out of my own earnings.
Governor, you said somewhere this past weekend you thought the Democrats would end up nominating Senator Kennedy.
Yes.
Do you think he'd be a strong candidate, and would Chappaquiddick be a major issue in that campaign?
Well, I think in the climate of asking people to disclose everything, I think that if he were a candidate, it should be logically accepted that the sealed records of Chappaquiddick would be opened up. I think that this would fit in the public demand that we have today. Yes, I think he's going to be the candidate. I think he'd be a strong candidate. I think in the effort to head off George Wallace at the convention, I think that Senator Kennedy is probably following a pattern, this is my own personal opinion, following a pattern of being a non-candidate until down at the convention he comes forth from a room in which it's been decided someone has to resolve the divisions in the party.
Governor, is the White House making any efforts to discourage your potential candidacy?
Not that I know of.
You've talked about the only major issue you've talked about is bigness in government. In the short time we have left, do you think that's going to be the principal issue or the only issue?
No, I think the big issue, if it continues right now, is the necessity to wage a long-term fight against inflation. Recession, of course, is cruel, and we should do everything we can to ease the pain of those who've lost their jobs because of recession, but we should not lose sight of the fact that there wouldn't be a recession if it were not for almost 40 years of inflationary policies. And those are the things that must be changed, or we're going to have this to go through all over again.
Thank you very much, Governor Reagan, for being with us today on Face the Nation.
Today on Face the Nation, former Governor of California, Ronald Reagan, was interviewed by CBS News correspondent Bruce Morton, David S. Broder, national political correspondent for the Washington Post, and by CBS News correspondent George Herman. Next week, another prominent figure in the news will face the nation. This broadcast was produced by CBS News.